So thank you to the team at Serene-risc for organizing this conference and for making the sessions publicly and freely available to the public. And of course, thank you to my co-panelists and all the panelists at this conference for their valuable insights. Last year, I had the opportunity to take on a research contract with the Cybersecurity Division at Global Affairs Canada, the goal of which was to bridge the literature gap between digital information communication technologies, or digital ICTs, and gender. I do want to make it clear that my views do not represent any government agency. I conducted the project as an independent researcher. Part of my goal with the project was to highlight how using gender as an analytical framework might better help us to develop cybersecurity policy and how we might better respond to instances of international insecurity. My background is in political science. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Waterloo, where I focus on the intersections between emerging technologies and international relations. The research on gender and digital ICTs has generally focused on addressing what is commonly called the digital divide, defined roughly as those who have access to the digital resources to engage, mobilize, and participate in public life, and those who do not. In comparison to men, women are more likely to be primary caregivers responsible for energy delivery to the household, less mobile, and more prone to social isolation. Digital ICTs come with a list of promises designed to mitigate these challenges. ICTs facilitate political mobilization, freedom of expression, remittances between diaspora communities, increase productivity and earnings between men and women, and release women's time from care and housework so that they can participate in markets. For these reasons, ICT infrastructure development has been central to the women's equality agenda, even as governments try to reconcile the tension between ICTs as tools that both enable political expression and perpetuate gendered harassment and violence. At this point, I do want to quickly say that the word gender is not synonymous with women. We all live our lives in gendered ways, and certainly there is a vibrant field of work that looks at men, masculinity, and international security. When we talk about gendering or gender mainstreaming governance or policy, what we're saying is that we cannot assume that policy affects everyone in the same way. It's one way to ensure that we can tailor policy to the needs of different demographic groups and ensure policy effectiveness. So, several UN member states have highlighted critical infrastructure protection as central to their national cybersecurity strategies. But critical infrastructure is often spoken of in terms of technical and computational vulnerabilities, which is a remnant from traditional security policy that conceptualized insecurity as a threat to state sovereignty. Yet, if critical infrastructure protection is necessary for social well-being, then it follows that ICT failures will also have negative social consequences. So why is it important to consider different gender perspectives when assessing the impact of malicious cyber operations? Taking gender seriously can be a corrective for a field, my field in particular, that routinely fails to predict shifts in the global order because of its focus on large-scale actors, meaning states or international organizations. In general, gender approaches to analyzing security are dedicated to making women empirically visible in a field that has historically ignored their role in shaping international affairs. If you don't include gender in your analysis, then you are ignoring half the planet's role in shaping international security. Practically, an analytical lens that excludes gender is going to be less predictive and yield a worse description of international affairs. It always strikes me as particularly ironic that in the age of big data, where the mantra seems to be that more data leads to greater objectivity, there's still pushback against integrating women's political experiences and indeed the experiences of other marginalized groups into policymaking. There are serious consequences to international security when we do not see ordinary people as valuable sources of knowledge. It means, for example, not anticipating the Arab Spring, the fall of the Berlin Wall, or South Korea's transition to democratic governance. There's also research in the field of international relations that indicates that a country's commitment to gender equality is an excellent predictor of state aggression on the international stage. And some authors argue that gender equality within a state's borders is a better predictor of international aggression than even democracy and levels of wealth. So recently, the field of international security has been advancing what we might call a national interest argument in regards to taking gender seriously. If you can incentivize a commitment to women's equality, the argument goes, then there are positive externalities that the international community can anticipate, such as increased international peacefulness and stability. And in the case of internet shutdowns, my research indicates that these issues do have gendered consequences and that they can undermine a commitment to eradicating gender inequality, broadly speaking. So as we know, internet shutdowns are increasing worldwide, from 106 in 2017 to 122 in 2019. This is in contrast to 10 years ago when internet shutdowns were infrequent. Internet shutdowns, as I define them here, are politically orchestrated critical infrastructure failures that come with a long list of negative effects on local communities. In less than 10 years, governments around the world have normalized internet shutdowns as a security response to both peaceful political mobilization and violent political protest. Most governments who conduct internet shutdowns can be classified broadly as low and middle income countries. Some scholars have conceptualized internet shutdowns as one tactic in an arsenal of tools that range from content filtering to coordinated misinformation to arresting individuals for online political expression. Several NGOs, however, have opted to mark internet shutdowns, including partial shutdowns that impact social media platforms, as a distinctive phenomenon. While content filtering has proliferated since September 11, 2001, amongst all regime types, internet shutdowns are perceived to be a newer form of information control, with one organization reporting that internet shutdowns cost the world $8 billion in 2019. My research involved conducting interviews with individuals who were involved with either internet governance and activism and who had firsthand experience with internet shutdowns, a term that I use to also include partial shutdowns and bandwidth throttling. NGOs have noted that communication blockades are particularly problematic when trying to work with vulnerable populations. Communication lines are blocked and NGOs can no longer provide their standard services to population groups that now faced the double burden of domestic and sometimes government-led violence, depending on where the internet shutdown is taking place. In Kashmir, which was frequently targeted in 2018 with internet shutdowns, women's rights activists struggled to provide counseling to women who were targeted with domestic violence. These personal reports largely replicate the larger findings from research on gendered violence during national emergencies and financial crises, a time when women in heterosexual relationships experience higher rates of sexual assault and intimate partner violence. When I asked my interview participants how NGOs continue to serve their constituencies during internet shutdowns, they responded by saying, and I quote, "They basically don't." And I'm still quoting here. "We lack social services even without internet shutdowns. So imagine what happens during internet shutdowns. When women need access to social services, then they're going to access programs using traditional mouth-to-mouth methods." One interviewee who participated in the 2019 Sudanese sit-in said that the internet shutdown impacted girls and women more than their male counterparts. The June 3rd sit-in was disrupted by the Transitional Military Council and was later dubbed the Khartoum Massacre after more than 100 people were killed. "Women and girls," and I'm quoting again, "are less likely to be allowed by their parents, guardians, or even husbands to leave the house. So we depend more on the internet to connect us to the news and to mobilize." This particular activist said that online spaces held distinct advantages for women, as women's offline mobilization came with increased risk to physical safety and harassment. The internet shutdowns created further restrictions on women's mobility. Women were less likely to participate as the sit-ins turned increasingly violent, and they increasingly relied on the internet access for situational awareness. And again, I quote, "If there are guns outside your house, at least you have the internet, and there are people telling you something is happening here and there. At least you don't feel alone." Online communities functioned as an informal crowdsourced violence warning system, where Twitter and Facebook users were able to broadcast location data about civil violence. In particular, Facebook Live became useful for documenting real-time political violence, since users could expect that these videos were authentic and undoctored. Indeed, we should think about the ways that content moderation policies intersect with internet shutdowns. Though there are greater calls for social platforms like Facebook to remove hateful and problematic posts, sometimes the imagery that's targeted and removed on these platforms are those associated with civil conflict. The images can indeed be gruesome, but they also provide documentation of human rights abuses that activists and governments can use to publicize human rights violations and keep governments accountable. Increasingly, women's rights advocates are also using digital ICTs to build resilience in the face of social disruption. These technologies are usually born in turbulent political climates where regime change and elections also highlight the precarious status of women's political and social rights. We can think of software applications like HarassMap, which was born during the Arab Spring in Egypt, and which might be considered the political movement that got governments to seriously consider internet shutdowns as a viable policy response during civil unrest. Ushahidi Inc. was born from the violence surrounding the 2007 Kenyan presidential election, where users could send texts and link photos of violence to particular geographic locations on Google Maps. Initially an election monitoring tool, Ushahidi has since expanded to log violence in countries impacted by natural disasters like Haiti, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. We can also think of privacy-preserving tools like Signal and WhatsApp, which feature end-to-end encryption, which is quite important for human rights activists and journalists to do their work effectively. Incidentally, WhatsApp is the social media platform that has been blocked most frequently. And often it's because political leaders cite the application for its role in spreading so-called fake news and fomenting political unrest. While most governments and international legal experts would say that the internet in itself is not a human right, there is widespread international agreement that the internet does enable human rights. This goes beyond freedom of expression. We're also talking about small business owners who depend on e-commerce. We're talking about the transfer of remittances, and we're talking about how individuals interact with their governments, a relationship which is increasingly mediated by digital tools. We can even go so far as to say that the proper functioning of internet infrastructure is crucial for removing the obstacles that unfairly prevent women from accessing the full range of rights and being full members of a political community. So I think I'll end this presentation by touching on why internet shutdowns are becoming a viable policy response. Regime type is likely a factor. Governments often form policy responses using what global governance scholars sometimes call a logic of appropriateness, meaning that policies will be formed based on values that are held by a particular regime. Very crudely, that means that liberal democracies are supposed to behave differently than authoritarian governments. There is some truth to that, but as I'll illustrate shortly, I think that characterization is sometimes exaggerated. Some new democracies may be tempted towards internet shutdowns because they lack the capacity to respond to misinformation. You're seeing Caribbean and Latin American states increasingly entertain the idea of internet blockages. I'm going to quote one of my respondents again. You can sue a newspaper in local court, but you can't sue Facebook. In the traditional world, you can revoke their license, but that can't happen with Facebook or WhatsApp. Keep in mind, I'm quoting someone from a lower middle income country. You can obviously, and people have sued Facebook in the so-called global north. There's also the fact that no country has really been seriously sanctioned for internet shutdowns. And again, I'm going to quote, even my country, which is fairly liberal, sees that if Hong Kong can do it, if India is doing it, which are fairly well-developed countries, then why can't we do it in our own country? Why not shut down WhatsApp? Because what use is it serving other than spreading political misinformation? And my country is not a military dictatorship. But if you see another country doing it, then it becomes the norm. I'm not aware of any country that has been sanctioned over an internet shutdown. Are you? End quote. And we are now seeing the wholesale banning of social media applications, as in the case of India, which is not only the internet shutdown capital of the world, but which has also banned social apps developed in China. And of course, the recent TikTok controversy in the United States, I think, is very important because traditionally, the US has been seen as an international player that is responsible for establishing the international order's moral and normative agenda. When a superpower bans a social media application, what kind of guidance does that give to other countries who don't even have the same regulatory capacity as the world's superpower? So perhaps I'll end on that provocative question. And I look forward to the questions that are going to be posed by the audience. Thank you so much for your time.